there's always that pause, isn't there, when you look at the and see if the IT is going to work, and the sound system is working, and it's 1800. So we'll kick off, and firstly, I'd like to welcome you all this evening. Thank you for supporting the Battle of the Atlantic Memorial Charity. It's great to see so many of you here. Other thank yous before we start, obviously to Peel Ports, who are the sponsor of this lecture series, to the Reverend Canon Dr. Crispin Palin for allowing us to use his fantastic building here, which is good. Also to Louise with the camera and Annalie outside, who are the ladies who put all the administration together. Thank you. And lastly, a big thank you to yourselves for coming here this evening. Also, I believe we've got some veterans in here. So I know Irene Slaters from Eaglet is here, so welcome. So tonight's talk is entitled A Game of Birds and Wolves. And before I forget, the book is on sale for $10.99 outside after the talk if you're interested, and the author, Simon Parkin, has said that he will sign those copies if you purchase them. So let's set the scene for you. 1941. It's not going well in the Atlantic. The U-boats are running rings around the ships. We're losing a lot of ships. And then something had to change. In 1942, they assembled a group, a retired naval captain and a clutch of brilliant young women, based in the Western Approaches. And their task was to see how to beat the U-boat threat. Or I suspect one of the other battles was to beat We've Always Done It That Way Brigade, because you can imagine at that time what it would have been like. Now, we are very lucky to have Simon Parkin with us this evening. He's an author and journalist. He writes in magazines, newspapers, and on the web. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's a finalist in the Foreign Press Association Media Awards, which I presume was America. He's also a recipient of 2 awards for the Society of Journalism, professional journalism, and he is also author of A Game of Birds and Wolves. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Simon and give a warm welcome to Simon Parkin, who's arrived here. Welcome to Liverpool.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, good. It's so lovely to be in Liverpool on what a beautiful day it is as well. I'm about 3/4 of the way through a new book project about the Siege of Leningrad, so it's quite nice to come to Liverpool and talk about board games. So yes, when I was a child, my brother and I spent our summer holidays at our grandparents' house in Devon. They loved board games and had an old wooden chest full of them. And one day, in amongst the boxes of Scrabble, Monopoly, and Bagatelle, we found a copy of Battleships. Now, this wasn't the plastic tabletop version with which you're all familiar, but rather a luxurious version of the game that was played out on a giant map that you would spread across the floor. And we'd take turns to throw the dice and then maneuver our ships into opposing positions. And then at the press of a button on a destroyer, a small plastic disc would fire along the board like a miniature hockey puck. And if your aim was true, the disc would slot into a hole at the base of your target. And through some toy maker's magic, the top of the ship would spring off into the air like a cap rocketing from a bottle of lemonade. My grandfather, you can see there, he never spoke much about the war. I knew that he had been a merchant seaman, but not when or where he had sailed, or even if he had seen combat at sea. And as such, I never put together why he might own this particular game, or why he would sometimes watch from the doorway while we played. A few years ago, I started work on a radio documentary for The New Yorker, all about wargaming. For those of you who don't know, wargaming is a tool used by politicians, civil servants, and the military to explore via the medium of dice and play the potential effects of world events. So in recent years, for example, the British government has used war games to envision the potential effects of a second referendum on Brexit, forcing civil servants to role-play as Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson and other leading figures in the Brexit drama. When Donald Trump visited London a few years ago, all of the London services staged war games to see what the threats might be involved in that. And of course, during the current conflict in Ukraine, war games are playing a major role in that as well. During the making of this radio program, I visited the Defence Academy in Shrivenham, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And there I met a man called Major Tom Muat. Major Tom is essentially His Majesty's game designer-in-chief, a kind of Dungeons and Dragons moderator dressed in khaki fatigues. He has run war games everywhere from the Pentagon to Beijing. I asked Tom if he had an example of where something that had been learned in the crucible of a war game had gone on to be used in the real world. And he explained that the hotline that links the White House to the Kremlin, often represented in films of the 1970s as a red telephone, was an idea that came out of war games played during the Cold War. Then he mentioned a little-known story about a retired naval captain called Gilbert Roberts and a group of young women who had together invented a war game that radically changed the course of the Second World War. In the last week of 1941, Britain had come perilously close to defeat. The UK is an island nation, reliant on imported goods for much of its resources. At that time, in fact, no less than 95% of Britain's fuel came into the country from trading partners and colonies, while 70% of our food supply was imported. In total, an average of 68 million tons of food and fuel was delivered by a 3,000-strong merchant shipping fleet each year. The sailors of these ships knew from the bitter experience of the First World War that the safest way to cross the Atlantic was to move in convoys, finding safety in numbers. So they would gather together in groups, sometimes consisting of more than 60 vessels, and sail in tight formation. The Royal Navy sent warships to protect these flocks of boats, and the escort ships, as they were known, as the protectors were known, encircled the convoy as it plodded its slow and heavy-laden course, a bit like sheepdogs protecting a herd of sheep, ready to fend off any attacks. Even before the outbreak of the Second World War, Karl Dönitz, leader of the U-boat arm of the German Navy, reasoned that if his fleet of submarines could block and sink these convoy ships, Britain, an island unable to sustain its people without imports, would starve. In this way, hunger, the blunt, persistent weapon of war, could be deployed against Germany's enemy from a position of remove. This is really, what I'm talking about here is the reason for all of these festivities. This is what was going on in the Atlantic. Dönitz had long believed that the most effective way to attack the British ships was to organize his U-boats into packs, like wolves who would hunt the sheep. It was a tactic he had tentatively explored as a captain of his own U-boat during the First World War, just before he was captured by the British and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Sheffield. Incidentally, he managed to earn a prison transfer to a lunatic asylum shortly after he pretended to be a U-boat, convincing his captors that he had lost his mind. The Rudel tactic, or wolf pack tactic, was borrowed from the wolves of his childhood fairy tales. Wolves, Dönitz knew, would hunt cooperatively. By working as a pack, they can bewilder and run down prey that is too large to tackle alone. Togetherness also affords the animals the ability to care for wounded pack members without sacrificing momentum. What better way, Dönitz reasoned, for U-boats to hunt, not as loners picking off stragglers, but as an organized pack, touring the sea with shared focus and intention, able to take down far stronger foes than they might otherwise. The belief that if Britain's supply lines were broken, then British defeat would soon follow, was not limited to the Germans. Prime Minister Winston Churchill described merchant shipping as at once the stranglehold and sole foundation of our war strategy. This fundamental truth was acknowledged in a chart that took up almost the entirety of one of the walls in the operation room at the Admiralty, the Navy's London headquarters. This graph, which charted the number of ships that had been sunk at sea, showed in the starkest terms imaginable the stakes at play. The top quarter of the graph was divided by a thin red line that marked the threshold between victory and defeat. If the rate of ship sinking stayed below the line, then the British people could survive on the amount of food and fuel that was making it in. But if the graph exceeded the red line, the country could no longer continue to participate in the war. While Dönitz was not given anywhere close to the 300 U-boats that he estimated via his own war games that he would need to blockade Britain, the embryonic wolf-pack attacks that began towards the end of 1940 immediately showed their effectiveness. In British shops, fish became scarce and expensive, while butter, bacon and sugar could only be bought with coupons. Onions, which prior to the war were imported from Spain, France and the Channel Islands, vanished from greengrocers, as did lemons and bananas. The frequency and success of the U-boat attacks steadily climbed, and by the end of 1940, the U-boats had sunk more than 1,200 ships, about 5 years' worth of construction work in typical peacetime conditions, and more than the rest of the German Navy and Air Force combined. The numbers told, if not the whole story of the Battle of the Atlantic, then the salient point. The British were losing catastrophically. Someone had to figure out what was making the U-boats so effective, and what, if anything, might be done to upturn that success. Gilbert Roberts was a 41-year-old former naval commander who had been discharged from the Navy in 1938 following a bout of tuberculosis. After he recovered from his illness, he found himself a young retiree with neither a ship nor a purpose. He joined the Home Guard and for a stint, and then worked as a police officer in a Devon constabulary. Neither of these roles much suited Roberts, who was a talented tactician and war game designer. He was also a heroic man, even before the arrival of war. Once, while reading a book on a Cornish cliffside, Roberts spied a group of walkers as they struggled to climb from the mouth of a cave against the tides rushing. Roberts tripped down the cliff, plunged into the water, and for more than an hour fought the waves to recover one of the sightseers. In the early months of war, Roberts was further tested. One night during the Blitz, while sheltering in the basement of his South London accommodation, Roberts heard a thud on the ground above. He climbed the stairs to peek through the window, and there, in the light of an overhead flare, saw a bent, oily German bomb half buried in the pavement, its fuse still sparking. Roberts ran out of the house and snatched out the fuse, burning his fingers badly in the process. In the last week of 1941, Roberts received an unexpected summon to the Admiralty offices. He was told to bring with him an overnight bag, and there he met two of the Navy's most senior officers, one an aide to Winston Churchill. Together, the men described the true extent of Britain's ongoing losses in the Atlantic. That Britain had come so close to starvation had been deliberately kept from the British public. Churchill routinely exaggerated the number of U-boat losses in his public speeches. For example, at Mansion House on the 20th of January 1940, at a moment when British forces had sunk just 9 of Germany's 57 operational U-boats, Churchill claimed to have sunk half the U-boats with which Germany began the war. To arrive at this conclusion, he had added 16 U-boats that the Admiralty believed may have been sunk to the 9 that they knew to have been sunk, and then added for good measure a further 10 of his own imagining. As such, when Roberts was told the awful truth of the situation, he was astonished. He was then informed that because of his achievements in running war games in Portsmouth, he had been chosen to figure out the secret to the U-boat's success in the Atlantic. Roberts' task was threefold. Firstly, to discover the secret of how the U-boats were operating. Secondly, to develop effective countermeasures. And finally, to teach these new tactics, whatever they might be, to any and every captain due to sail the Atlantic. Tuberculosis may have robbed him of the chance to serve at sea, but it had, in this rather unlikely way, provided him with an opportunity to make his presence felt on every destroyer and corvette on the ocean. Before he left the Admiralty to catch the midnight train to Liverpool, Roberts was led into an office where he came face to face with Churchill, who barked, "Find out what is happening and sink the U-boats." Roberts arrived in Liverpool to a beleaguered city. Hitler later admitted that he had targeted Liverpool with his bombers because he believed it housed the headquarters from which the Battle of the Atlantic was being orchestrated. His guess was correct. In fact, Derby House, home to this command centre, had already been successfully hit by German incendiaries, although the bombers wouldn't have known it. When Roberts arrived, he was informed that he was to be given 8 rooms on the top floor of the building. He could move in just as soon as the roof had been repaired. Roberts' first meeting with the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Percy Noble, was a complete disaster. After dismissively asking what precisely Roberts planned to do with his games, Noble told him, "Well, you can carry on, but don't bother me with it. I'm busy." The next question was who precisely was going to assist Roberts in his work. By 1942, most men who were able to serve in the Navy had been enlisted and already deployed. The Navy, in its desperation to find workers, turned to young women, advertising posts in the Wrens with the slogan, "Join the Wrens and free a man for the fleet." The Wrens' motto at the time was "Never at sea," a pledge that carries with it a sort of negative space assurance that we know our place. What other organisation has ever been defined by what its members are forbidden from doing, rather than that which they hope to achieve? But nevertheless, under the stewardship of Vera Lawton-Matthews, a former activist for the suffragettes, the Wrens were gradually deployed to all manner of interesting and essential roles. Some became welders, others became carpenters, some loaded torpedoes onto submarines, and many plotted the progress of live sea battles onto maps hung in operations rooms, just like the giant plot at Derby House. Of course, if you don't know, the plot is still there. It's recently been restored at the Western Approaches Museum. You should definitely go and see it if you haven't. The Wrens' heroism often matched that of the men that they had freed for duty. In 1942, for example, Pamela McGeorge was asked to deliver an important dispatch from one side of Plymouth to the Commander-in-Chief at the other. She drove her motorcycle through the night while the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on the city. And when one bomb landed close to the road, McGeorge was blown from her bike. Its wheels were mangled beyond repair. Undeterred, she continued on foot to Admiralty House with the letter in hand. And when she arrived, she offered immediately to head out again with the response. At Derby House, Roberts was introduced to 10 young Wrens, some of whom had only recently left school, who were to be his supporting team. These young women had been handpicked for their aptitude in mathematics and statistics. The first and most senior woman assigned to the team was Jean Laidlaw, an assiduous 21-year-old obsessed with ships and sailing, and who later became one of Britain's first female chartered accountants. Then there was Laura Janet Howes, who had come to England from Antigua just 4 years earlier. Howes was a mathematical genius, and at school, when her teachers were off sick, she would teach the class in their stead. Elizabeth Drake was next. Drake's father, Charles, worked as an actuary for the Prudential Assurance Company, and Drake was chosen to work with Roberts based on the assumption that an aptitude for mathematics, like height or temper, runs in the family. The last of the Wren officers was a sportswoman, Nancy Wales. Nan, as she was known to her friends, was older than the others at 27. She was a formidable tennis player and competed in badminton at a county level, but hockey was her true passion. 2 years later, she would play for Lancashire and then earn the unique distinction of being the only player to go on to play for their arch rivals, Yorkshire, a team that she then captained for many years. The unit, which became known as the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, or WATU, was given the top floor of Derby House. As Roberts' dismal first meeting with his superior Percy Noble demonstrated, the unit was viewed with tremendous skepticism by many senior officers who wondered what these people were doing playing games while there was a war on. As such, Roberts and his team of Wrens worked quietly in their top floor home, trying not to attract too much attention until they had something to bring to their superiors. WATU's office resembled something between a school gymnasium and, with the scattered sticks of chalk and tumbles of string laying around, a child's playroom. The linoleum floor was divided into sections. You can just about make them out there. A bit like a giant chessboard. Each line was spaced 10 inches apart to represent a distance of 1 nautical mile, and the counters represented ships and surfaced German U-boats. Around the edges of the room were great sheets of white canvas. These were arranged into enclosures, a bit like voting booths, except each one had a peephole cut into it at eye level. The average visibility from the bridge of a warship is 5 miles, and the canvas sheets were positioned in such a way that when a player peeked through the slit, he or she could see the equivalent of a 5-mile view of the tiny wooden ships on the floor. Linen side wires, which could be bent to adjust visibility, depending on the game scenario that was being played, held the apertures open. One team was positioned behind the canvas sheets at desks, and they played as the escort captains. And the other team, which was normally captained by Roberts or Jean Laidlaw, played as the U-boats. As in the real Battle of the Atlantic, each side's objective was focused on the convoy ships. The escort captains had to protect them, while the U-boat captains had to attack them. And each side also had a secondary objective. For the escort ships, that was to sink as many U-boats as possible, while for the U-boats, the aim was to avoid detection and exit the battlefield unharmed. The convoy ships, which was the prize in play for both sides, would automatically move forward at the start of each turn of the game toward their destination, while the battle raged around them. Players were given just 2 minutes in which to submit their orders for the next turn to replicate the urgency of a real battlefield. And the movements of the U-boats were then drawn in green chalk on the floor, the colour chosen as it was impossible to make out against the linoleum when viewed from an angle. And this ensured that the U-boat positions were undetectable to the players standing behind the canvas screens. The escort ships would then be added to the floor in white chalk, which was, in contrast to the green markings, legible to those peeking out of the canvas sheets. Turn by turn, the pieces would move around the floor as the escort ships dashed to the site of an explosion to drop their depth charges, and the U-boats performed their feints and dodges in an effort to pick off convoy ships while evading the escort. The Wrens acted something like umpires, measuring distances and marking movements in chalk to ensure that the game played out as accurately as possible. And then finally, at the end of the game, the players would come together and sit around the board, which was now crisscrossed with chalk markings, and Roberts would reveal how everyone had fared. The game was a simplification of real U-boat action, of course, but there was enough here to begin staging recent sea battles. The objective was to experience the action from the perspective of the U-boats, and then, from that knowledge, assess what the escort commanders might have done differently to save ships, supplies, and lives. With the rudiments of the game in place, Roberts now spent a great deal of his time studying the after-action reports that had been written by naval officers who battled U-boats and survived in search of clues to their tactics. His position here in Liverpool meant that he was ideally situated to meet and quiz every naval officer who passed through Western Approach's command. Roberts did not have to rely solely on the written testimony of sailors. He could also interview them as the men returned from sea. And during the course of several interviews, a rather chaotic picture emerged. Not only was there no universal set of tactics with which to fight U-boats, neither was there any training for how escort ships should work as a team. The destroyers and corvettes, it seemed to Roberts, were broadly free to direct their response according to their captain's individual whim. Fred Osborne, who was first lieutenant of the corvette HMS Gentian, and who later worked at WATU, described convoy defense at this time as difficult and haphazard in the absence of collective countermeasures. No clear doctrine for combating attacks on convoys had been formulated and taught, he wrote, and as such, the losses are appalling. Roberts asked every escort captain he interviewed the same question: what do you do when one of your merchant ships is torpedoed? Some of the men spoke of going to action stations, others about increasing their speed, but when they were pressed, most shrugged in resignation. What could you do, blind in the night, with explosions sounding all around when your radar operator was unable to distinguish the sound of a U-boat from the noise of a choppy sea or even a shoal of fish. There was another reason why the naval escorts were having such an awful time hunting U-boats. This was an incorrect assumption about the way in which U-boats were attacking, and it had resulted in thousands of deaths at sea. Roberts didn't know it yet, but his task in turning around Allied fortunes at sea would rest on his successfully uncovering this cardinal error in British understanding of how the U-boats operated. To understand this error, we need to meet this man, 28-year-old Otto Kretchmer, perhaps the most famous of Germany's 3 U-boat aces. The young U-boat commando was taciturn and focused. One of his nicknames was Silent Otto, but he inspired utter loyalty from his crew, many of whom were young men, themselves barely out of school. Kretchmer's contribution to German U-boat strategy was profound. In the early months of war, U-boat captains would attack Allied ships from outside the boundary of a convoy. This was to abide by the recommendation of the manufacturers of their torpedoes, which advised ensuring a distance of no less than 1 kilometer between a U-boat and its target. There was also uncertainty about the effectiveness of British sonar detection, which at the time was known as ASDIC, and that led many U-boats to fire their torpedoes only from well outside the detection range of the escorts at a range of 3 kilometers or even more. Kretchmer, however, wanted to see what would happen if he could slip past the naval escort ships, enter the lanes of the convoy, and fire practically from point-blank range. His motto was 1 ship, 1 torpedo, and the less distance between his target and his U-boat, the easier it would be to keep to. Kretchmer first attempted the maneuver in September 1940. One night he slunk in between the escort ships in the cover of darkness on the surface of the water in order to evade detection by sonar. And then, like a fox inside a henhouse, he successfully sank 3 ships, firing his torpedoes at pretty much point-blank range. When he returned to the U-boat base in the captured French port of Lorient later that month, Kretchmer wrote up his findings in a set of standing orders for his crew. The document laid out the rules for the efficient and successful running of a U-boat, a 12-point plan that covered everything from the need for an effective lookout to the requirement that the men set aside time to clean their dishes. Most of the instructions were commonsensical. Point 9, however, went against the written advice that U-boat captains maintain a minimum distance of 1 kilometer between the U-boat and its target. Kretchmer wrote plainly that at every given opportunity, torpedoes should be fired at extreme close range. This can only be done, he wrote, by penetrating the escort's anti-submarine screen and getting inside the convoy lanes. This, he added, should be the objective of all our attacks. In just 2 sentences, Kretchmer had outlined a tactic that would, in the months to come, lead to the deaths of thousands of Allied sailors and raised the line on the chart of shipping losses at the Admiralty in London perilously close to the threshold of defeat. One of WATU's first tasks was to restage a battle from a few weeks earlier, in December 1941, in which British ships had successfully destroyed 3 U-boats. Roberts and his team believed that the battle for convoy HG-76, held some of the secrets they were searching for. The team arranged 48 ships in 12 columns on the floor and added the tracks of the 3 U-boats that were known to have participated in the battle. Now, with the stage set, Roberts began to move the convoy, which spread across 6 white lines on the floor to represent its 6-mile width, in 2-minute intervals and at a simulated rate of 10 knots. Each move was made in precisely the same pattern as the actual escort a few weeks earlier. Blow by blow, Roberts imitated the action as per the official reports. Seeing the battle from a crow's nest perspective above the board, a question formed in his mind. If the U-boats were firing from outside the perimeter of the convoy, as was widely believed, how had HMS Anavor, which was at the center of the convoy, been sunk? Might it be possible, he wondered, that the U-boat had attacked the ship from inside the lanes of the convoy? Hold everything, Roberts told his staff, and he rushed into his office to make a phone call. He picked up the receiver and asked the operator to put him through to the Flag Officer Submarines in London, hoping to speak to its Chief of Staff, an old friend, Captain Ian McIntyre. To Roberts' astonishment, the Flag Officer himself, Admiral Sir Max Horton, picked up. Horton was an officer of foreboding distinction. As a young submarine commander, he had scored the first naval kill of the First World War. And on return to port, he would signal success to onlookers by flying the pirates' flag, the Jolly Roger, a tradition that continued thereafter until the end of the Falklands War. Horton's precocious talent as a submariner propelled him up the ranks, and years later his biographer described him as the greatest authority on submarine warfare. So on the phone, Roberts explained who he was and asked Horton if he might be permitted to ask a question. During the last war, Roberts asked, would you ever have crept among the ships of a convoy before you fired your torpedo? Of course, replied Horton. That is the only way of pressing home an attack. Thank you, sir, said Roberts, and hung up the phone. It was late, but Roberts asked Laidlaw and one of the other young wrens, Janet O'Kell, if they might stay behind with him to reset the plot and run a new game on the board. The two women, infused with Roberts' excitement, agreed and hurriedly reset the game. Between them, Roberts and the wrens began to plot different scenarios that might have enabled the U-boat to sneak into the convoy without being detected. Only one checked out. The U-boat must have entered the columns of the convoy from astern, and it must have done so on the surface of the water, where it was able to travel at a faster speed than the ships it pursued. By approaching from astern, where the lookouts rarely checked, the U-boat would be able to slip inside the convoy undetected, fire at close range, then submerge in order to get away. Roberts and the wrens headed to the kitchen to make coffee and a round of corned beef sandwiches. The conversation continued to center on the battle they had left on the floor of the game room. The group discussed how, if they were a U-boat captain, having made a point-blank attack on a merchant ship, they might then attempt to escape the battlefield unharmed. The game had enabled the fledgling tacticians to begin to think like U-boat captains, and from this perspective, the answer suddenly seemed obvious. Having made your attack, you would of course dive, and then you would sit and wait for the convoy to roll on overhead. Eventually, Roberts wrote, I would emerge deep from the stern of the convoy. With Kretchmer's U-boat tactic abruptly unveiled, Roberts wanted to try out some potential countermeasures that might foil the plan. The team returned to the game room, and Roberts assumed the role of the U-boat captain, while Laidlaw and O'Kell played as the escort ships. A countermeasure revealed itself immediately. Rather than splay out from the convoy at speed and drop depth charges at random, as was current common practice, Laidlaw and O'Kell lined the escort ships up around the convoy. And while the convoy continued on its way, each escort ship performed a triangular sweep, listening for U-boats on the Aztec. They immediately picked up the position of the attackers in the game. With a mounting sense of excitement, the team ran the procedure twice more, and in both instances, Roberts' U-boat was detected and sunk. It was by now the early hours of the morning. In all the excitement, time had passed unnoticed. So Roberts ordered a staff car to return the two women back to their digs. The next morning, Roberts invited the skeptical Admiral Percy Noble to watch a demonstration of their findings. Noble entered the game room flanked by his staff. The commander-in-chief warily eyed the chalk markings on the floor and the canvas sheets decked out to look like ship portholes. What was all this make-believe nonsense? Undeterred, Roberts began to explain his and his team's discoveries, how the U-boats would slip between the convoy ships on the surface of the water at night when they were unlikely to be spotted, how they would make their attacks and then dive to wait until danger had passed. The atmosphere was rather frosty. Noble had made no secret of his condescending skepticism towards WATU's work. Roberts detected a tone in Noble's manner, he wrote, of snootiness. How could this former naval officer, with his nubs of chalk and jumbles of string, contribute anything to the battles being waged at sea? But as the game played out, the Admiral began to sit forward in his chair. One of the wrens, playing as a U-boat, fired a torpedo from within the convoy's columns, then dived. Roberts performed the team's newly developed counter-tactic, moving the escort ships in triangular sweeping patterns designed to flush out the hidden U-boat. And while performing these sweeps, one of the escort ships picked up the Germans' position on its radar. As he watched, Noble saw for the first time the errors that had been responsible for such a tremendous loss of life at sea. And when the demonstration was finished, the Admiral stood to his feet, congratulated Roberts, and asked what the maneuver was to be called. Jean Laidlaw, the 21-year-old woman responsible for statistical analysis, explained that she had christened it Raspberry. It was, she said, a razz of contempt aimed at Hitler and his U-boat fleet. The commander-in-chief then turned to one of his men. Oh, that's Max Horton. Sorry, I'm a bit behind. The commander-in-chief then turned to one of his men and told him to take down a message to be sent to the Prime Minister. It read, "The first investigations have shown a cardinal error in U-boat tactics. A new, immediate and concerted counterattack will be signalled to the fleet within 24 hours. Raspberry was a revolutionary tactic, and its effect on the war at sea was immediate. Shortly after the demonstration to Noble, WATU began running week-long courses for naval officers who would play imaginary battles, learn how to perform the counter-tactics, which soon included a variety of other operations, many of which were named after different fruit. For the officers playing as escort commanders behind the canvas peepholes, the games were intense. The pressure of the 2-minute intervals between turns mimicked the stress of action against U-boats at sea, and each officer would often become caught up in the fiction, no longer viewing the chalk lines and the wooden models just as game pieces, but as real ships, wakes, and explosions that they represented. The game occupied an unusual position between reality and make-believe. No lives were lost here on the linoleum ocean, but neither was the game fully abstract in the way that Monopoly is based on, but distinct from the property business. For the men who played WATU's games, who had often returned from sea just a few days earlier, and who were due to sail again a few days later, the game had an unsettling quality. The choices each man made on the floor reflected his current tactical thinking. If his ship was lost in the game, he had to contend with the knowledge that had the same situation arisen at sea and he acted in the same way, he may well have lost his ship. Make your mistakes here, and you won't make them at sea, Roberts became fond of saying, a euphemistic way of pointing out the scale of risk against which the game was attempting to ensure its players. For all Roberts' engaging presentation, a man who failed to drive off a U-boat, or worse, who lost his ship in the game, would leave WATU feeling chastened. We destroy U-boats out in the oceans, wrote one observer who sat in on a round of the game, but the death sentence is delivered miles away in the Assize Court in that old building erected on the banks of the River Mersey. Of each course, which lasted from Monday to Saturday, oh, by the way, here is a illustration of the Raspberry tactic, drawn, I think, by Admiral Osborne, which is one of the first recordings of that. Each course, which lasted from Monday to Saturday and which ran weekly without interruption from the first week of February 1942 to the last week of July 1945, involved up to 50 officers at once. It consisted of 4 game scenarios which varied details such as the weather conditions, visibility, time of day, and the size, speed, and start point of the convoy. And finally, while the game finished, the officers would step out from behind their screens and, along with the wrens, sit in a square of chairs, as you can see here, around the room. And then with a 10-foot wooden pole, Roberts would commentate on the preceding battle, blow by blow, a bit like a sports pundit delivering a post-match verdict. He would draw attention to moments of particular brilliance and moments of particular disaster and the turning points of each game. These summations were for Roberts the most enjoyable aspect of the work. He relished the opportunity to create a picture of the battle far more vivid and engaging than the reports written by officers returning from earnest action at sea. As we listened to him, he made the most difficult situation appear simple, said Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson of Roberts' Flair. He appreciated the difficulty that hundreds of commanding officers had in deciding what to do when faced with any of the surprises that war at sea constantly presents, and he taught them how to meet these surprises until they were ready for anything. Still, the combination of ministration and expertise was not always welcomed by the experienced officers on the receiving end of advice from the young wrens. Often the men would resent being told what to do, no matter how gently, by young women who were barely out of school and who in some cases had never even been to sea in peacetime, let alone during wartime. During one 1942 game, for example, Bob Winnie, who captained the destroyer HMS Wanderer, in which he sank 3 U-boats, handed his chit to one of the wrens, Judy de Vivier, a particularly clued-up girl, as he described her, whom he had been assigned. "No, sir," Judy said of Winnie's chosen move, "I do not think you should do that." Good God, he later recalled thinking of her firm and polite request. What on earth does this girl know about it? But so confident and tactful was de Vivier's tone that Winnie chose to hear her out. He listened to the wren's convincing explanation in astonishment. From his perspective, a battle-worn captain was being tutored on the finer points of U-boat warfare by an inexperienced young woman. But for Roberts, this exchange vindicated a long-held belief. With careful design, wargames have the capacity to make experts of amateurs and to instill in players invaluable, potentially life-saving, battle-winning experience. In the summer of 1942, escort ships sank 4 times as many U-boats as the previous month, beginning an upward trend that would continue broadly for the rest of the year. In the months that followed the development of Raspberry, using information gleaned via debriefs, Roberts and the Wrens developed numerous other tactical maneuvers to suit the expanding variety of wolf pack attacks. Most of these movements, which involved the escort ships performing different shapes and varieties of coordinated sweeps to find and hunt lurking U-boats, were given the memorable names of fruit and vegetables such as pineapple, gooseberry, strawberry, artichoke, and a modification to the original maneuver known as a half-raspberry. The unit revolutionized British anti-submarine warfare. By the summer of 1943, the U-boats had been decisively driven from the Atlantic. During the period that the Germans subsequently dubbed Black May, the German Navy lost 41 U-boats, many to WATU-coined operations. It was a decisive tally on this, the impersonal scoresheet of war. Karl Dönitz, who was by now the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, but who never lost his first love for U-boats or the young men who crewed them, ordered the withdrawal of wolf packs from the Atlantic battlefield. It was, he insisted, merely a temporary and partial change of operations area. But 4 months later, the US Admiral Ernest King downgraded the U-boats to the category of problem rather than menace. In the 17 weeks that followed the 17th of May 1943, the Allies sailed 62 east and westbound convoys along North Atlantic routes without losing a single ship. More than 12 million tons of food and supplies arrived unimpeded into Britain from eastbound convoys. Seizing the opportunity, senior officers at the Admiralty increased the size of these convoys, and by June 1943 they averaged 62 ships compared to just 43 the previous month. The so-called tonnage war was finished, and with it, in most ways that mattered, the Battle of the Atlantic. Between the first week of February 42 and the last of July 1945, when WATU officially closed, close to 5,000 naval officers played the war game run by Captain Roberts and the Wrens during more than 130 courses. Graduates included the ornithologist and painter Peter Scott, remembered by one of the WATU Wrens for drawing ducks all over his navigational chart, and a young Philip Mountbatten, future husband to Queen Elizabeth II, whose presence around the unit brought many of the Wrens unending delight, as one put it. There was also the writer Nicholas Montserrat, who would go on to describe in his 1951 novel, The Cruel Sea, a convoy game played out with model ships on the floor of an empty room that was clearly based on his experiences at WATU. In addition to the thousands of British naval officers who completed the course, Roberts and the Wrens trained delegates from everywhere from the United States to India, Malaya to Norway, and 4 university professors. Many graduates of the game credited the battles they waged on the linoleum floor as instrumental in their subsequent victories during encounters with U-boats at sea. And similar tactical units then spread up across the British Empire, some of which were also staffed by young Wrens, who by playing the game time and again also became versed in anti-submarine warfare. By 1945, a total of 66 Wrens had completed the course in order to become staff at WATU, or one of its sister units. 2,603 merchant ships and 175 of the escorting naval vessels were sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. More than 30,000 merchant seamen and more than 6,000 Royal Navy sailors died in the Atlantic during the war, many in attacks by U-boats. It was an astonishing loss of life, somewhat tempered by the work of the men and women of WATU and the sailors who deployed their tactics at sea. At the end of the war, Sir Max Houghton, the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, who had been defeated in the game by two of WATU's Wrens, sent the following personal signal directed to all who had served in the unit. On the closing down of WATU, I wish to express my gratitude and high appreciation of the magnificent work of Captain Roberts and his staff, which has contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. Later, Churchill famously wrote, the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Without Roberts and the Wrens' work, the Battle of the Atlantic may have been lost, and perhaps the war with it. 4 weeks after the U-boats retreated from the Atlantic, my own grandfather, who was just 17 at the time, made his inaugural journey across the ocean in a merchant ship protected by naval officers trained by WATU. Thanks in major part to WATU's work, he arrived in New York untouched. Many of those involved in WATU's work never spoke of their role during the war, while the group's feat and contribution is barely remembered. By the fall of Berlin in 1945, the U-boat commanders were intimately familiar with Roberts, his team, and his tactics. Roberts spoke fluent German, and he was one of the first British officers to land in Germany following Nazi surrender. He was in Berlin the night the Americans performed their final bombing raid of the war. The following day, Roberts eagerly travelled to the U-boat headquarters in the German town of Flensburg. There he met the veteran submarine commander, architect of the Wolfpack tactic, and the man who later that week would become Hitler's successor as President of Germany, Admiral Karl Dönitz. The men exchanged respectful salutes. The other U-boat captains, however, appeared to blanch at the sight of Roberts. Their fear was soon explained as Roberts began his tour of the facility. He visited the U-boat operations room, and there, tacked to a wall, he saw his own photograph, cut from a magazine article, and beneath the image, a handwritten caption that read, "This is your enemy, Captain Roberts, Director of Anti-U-Boat Tactics." Games are usually dismissed as childish pursuits, something to be set down in adolescence, and maybe picked up again in retirement. But as Major Tom explained to me in Shrivenham, in times of great turmoil, war games rise in popularity and importance. That was true in 1942, and as the office rooms in the Pentagon and the Whitehall resound with the rattle of dice, it's equally true today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'll come back to you in a minute. We've got some time for some questions. If you can put your hand up, my able assistant at the back has got a microphone and bring it to you. Has anybody got any questions? Gentlemen there.
Right, thank you very much. In a past life, Captain Peter Woods, Ocean Commodore Saclamp 1. A fantastic talk, and I have read the book many times. But just to say that what you see on there is still ongoing. Having been to the Naval Tactical School, Georgia School of Warfare, everybody looks on TV these days and thinks it's all done by computers. It isn't. What those ladies did, and what he did, is still continuing to this day, and it works extremely well.
Thank you.
One just here at the front.
Did the Kriegsmarine under Donitz, did they ever use the equivalent to the Wrens in their tactical combat scenarios against the Allies?
Yeah, so they certainly ran war games throughout the duration of the war, and there was, I believe, an equivalent use of young women volunteers in those games. Quite what the role was, I'm not sure. I don't think there's been that much research into that, but I do have in the book a reference to, I think, some young German women who performed a sort of equivalent role, but yeah, the exact details of that I'm not sure on. Yeah.
Any more questions? No. Yep, sorry.
Thank you. Is there a German language version of the book?
Sorry, what was that?
No, it's a serious question. I've got friends.
Couldn't hear the question.
Is there a German language version of the book?
No, not in German, no. It's in Japanese and Italian as well, but in terms of Axis powers, but not Germany. No.
Okay, watch this space. I've got friends.
Right, there's no more questions. Simon, thanks very much. As a young anti-submarine warfare officer and subsequently as a destroyer captain, I went through the same tactical unit or the modern equivalent on a number of times. And I can still remember then the young Wrens who were running it, and they were incredibly knowledgeable, and it was a very, very interesting unit. Most of the courses I went through, there was lots of people from other navies still learning from us, and it was until they closed HMS Dryad, still a wooden floor with people sitting around with little things you moved around, and that was back in the 90s and the noughties, and we still used it then. So that was it for me personally. That was an incredibly interesting talk. I have to say, to my own annoyance, I didn't know much about that, and I should have done. So I'm glad you brought that to life to us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Our next talk is on April the 27th, and that's about the air, which I also know a bit about, and anti-submarine warfare from the air. Thank you very much for attending. Please stay safe and have a safe journey through. And one last round of applause, please, for Simon Strock.